So good to see you.
Great to see you, Ellen.
Really, really appreciate you being here. So we had a wild weekend. You had a wild weekend.
We're waiting to see whether the government would stay open or shut down.
And really all that happened was they kicked the ball down the road 45 days, and Moody's is threatening to downgrade U.S. debt. So I guess the first question for you is this mess going to change the relative optimism you had about the U.S. economic outlook?
Look, I'm very optimistic about the U.S. economic outlook. Short term, inflation is coming down in the context of an extremely strong labor market, what people would normally call a soft landing.
Which is amazing, by the way. It hardly ever happens.
Correct. And it's great because, of course, we want to see inflation come down. It's been burdening Americans, but we want to maintain the good, strong labor market that we have. And we seem to be on that kind of path. And medium term, we are now engaging in a very substantial program of investments to strengthen our economy, to boost our productive capacity, to boost productivity growth, to draw more American workers into the labor market, and to address long-standing structural problems like climate change and inequality across people, races, and places.
I want to talk about that, but before I do, I suppose I should let this group in on a little secret about our past.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, which I hesitate to do because it highlights my age and may then also highlight your age.
May well do.
But I have a master's degree in economics, which I got at the London School of Economics, which was the 1 year that Secretary Yellen taught there. So she taught what little I know about macroeconomics. I learned from Janet Yellen.
It was an honor to have you as my student.
I have wonderful memories of you drawing ISLM curves and Phillips curves on that big blackboard.
Great tools.
So I asked this question with that in mind. The people who almost hung us up this weekend are concerned about government spending. We have a budget deficit of $1.5 trillion. If I had said to you back when we were at the London School of Economics that we were going to end up in that place, I think you would have used your curves to show me that's not a good scenario. So how is it that that's okay?
Okay, that's a great question. And as Treasury Secretary, I feel it's my job to worry about fiscal sustainability. So I do think it's critical that we establish spending and revenue targets that put us on a path where fiscal policy is sustainable and a path that's consistent with solid growth. And I believe at the moment we're on such a path. So one way to judge it, because our economy is now all about big numbers, and $1 trillion is certainly a big number.
$1.5 trillion.
Our economy has a large GDP and so forth. I think the metric that I think is most relevant to judging fiscal sustainability is the amount that we're spending to service the debt, real net interest payments as a share of GDP. How much of our GDP goes to service the debt? And the answer over the next 10 years in the mid-session review, which is the most recent budget forecasts that the administration prepared, the answer is 1%. So real net interest as a share of GDP is about 1%. That's historically completely normal. Some guidelines would say try to keep it under 2%, but it's 1% for the next decade. Now, I will say that that budget does assume meaningful deficit reduction over the next 10 years. There were $3 trillion of deficit reduction incorporated into it, along with a significant program of investments in our economy, but ones that are financed by collecting greater revenues in a way that we think is fair, where the burden largely falls on corporations and very high-income taxpayers.
And I do want to come back to the investment piece of it, but before I do, I mean, the other thing that assumption depends on is how high, how long do interest rates stay, which is a big issue not just for the government, but for any company that's carrying a substantial amount of debt. How long are we going to, are we going to have to roll over all our debt at rates that are double what we initially had?
So, well,
so tell them the answer.
The answer is I don't know, and it's a great question, and it's one that's very much on my and the administration's minds. When the administration came in, it was the pandemic. We had a decade of interest rates. Short-term interest rates were zero, long-term interest rates higher, but very much lower than today's interest rates. And the interest burden was almost non-existent at that point. Now, the forecasts we've made assume that interest rates will rise toward more normal levels. But we are seeing, especially over the last several months, a pretty significant increase in not only 10-year nominal yields, but also real yields. And there's a question mark just why that is.
Are we going back to something that looks more like the history prior to 10 years ago than the last 10 years?
That's right. And that's a very important question. One view is that it may take a longer period of somewhat higher interest rates to control inflation, to keep it down, but medium-term interest rates will go back to more normal levels. It's also possible that longer-term interest rates will be higher than we thought. But I would point out that for many decades, the level of real interest rates, not only in the United States, but in many advanced economies, had been moving down.
Yeah.
And it was felt by most economists that there were strong structural reasons why that was occurring.
This is why I loved you as a teacher way back when, because you could explain to me both sides of the equation. But what do you think? Give us do you think we're going to go back to extraordinarily low interest rates, or do you think we're going to be living with this for a long time?
So I think the structural forces that led us to believe interest rates would be low, they're alive and well. And we're talking about aging populations, high propensities to save, globally weak investment opportunities. Now, there are a lot of investment opportunities associated with climate change. You could imagine a world where we get very serious about investment in climate-related investments, and if investment were generally stronger, both private and government, that could push up real interest rates. I'm not sure we're on that path, although in the United States we are seeing a meaningful increase in investment.
And I am going to get to that, I promise. But the other thing we've been talking about here today is the extraordinarily quick adoption of generative AI technology. I think Eric Brynjolfsson said earlier that most waves of technology take like 10 years before you start to see them in the productivity numbers. He thinks this one's going to be much faster. We've heard lots of anecdotal evidence of huge productivity gains. If I studied my books correctly way back then, big increases in productivity could make a huge difference to all the things we're talking about, growth, inflation, et cetera. Do you think we're on the verge of we've had disappointing productivity for the last decade. Are we on the verge of something significantly better?
So I will say I'm not an expert in AI. From what I understand, as you just said, the progress in this area is unbelievably rapid. And I think it could make a significant difference. As an administration, as a country, we're also working on a whole set of investments that should be productivity boosting over the medium term. We're addressing the problem of crumbling roads and highways and an infrastructure that really hasn't been appropriately designed for a modern economy. We have a huge, we passed really a trifecta of legislation: the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the Chips and Semiconductor Act, and then the Inflation Reduction Act. So we're investing in R&D in ways we haven't in decades, restoring U.S. leadership in science and technology. We have a huge program of incentives for clean energy.
So you're betting on a
investment.
significant increase in productivity.
Yes, but let me be careful, because productivity growth, usually a tenth or two here or there, is regarded as a big thing. So I don't want to pull numbers out of a hat that are gigantic. I think there will be a payoff, but I don't want to exaggerate it.
So let's talk about the investment agenda, because you've focused on it. Investment of infrastructure, obviously that's important to the economy, needs to happen, and kudos on making that happen. Investment in R&D, we've seen how that pays off. That's where the internet came from, right? Government R&D. But we're also doing something that, in my career, we've never done before, which is really a big move towards industrial policy. What we're doing with semiconductors, what we're doing on batteries, what we're doing on solar, trying to recreate those industries in the United States. I guess my question for you is, theoretically, I get the case for that, but that is not something we have much experience or skill at doing. We don't have the institutions to do it. We don't have a political system that can support it over the long term. I mean, we don't know what's going to happen in the next election. It could be an administration that's opposed to all those programs. So how can you give this group confidence that those things will work? So
I believe, although throughout my career, it's not as though I've been a strong believer in industrial policy generally. I think if you look at the semiconductor industry and the way in which it's evolved globally over decades, what you see are enormous government interventions in virtually every country that plays a significant role. And the United States has sat back on its hands and allowed other countries to, through massive subsidies, to really build their own capacity in semiconductors. And I think this is an issue where there are real national security concerns, and there are technology spillovers and interactions that we're fooling ourselves if we think that abandoning, for all practical purposes, semiconductor manufacturing is a smart strategy for the United States.
And how many areas like that are there? Mark Warner was on this stage earlier this morning, and he was talking about a pretty big expansion from the ones I've already mentioned. He was talking about biotechnology, he mentioned several other categories. He thinks we have to get in this game in a big way.
So you mentioned two, and those are the two that I think we're focused on. Semiconductors, in part because its critical role, both national security and to other technological developments, that I think that's justified. And in the case of clean energy, partly I think we have developed a huge overdependence on China as a supplier in these areas. And China has enormously subsidized its industry. We had a solar panel manufacturing industry in the United States that was essentially put out of business. Maybe we'll talk about China. I'm not sure if that's where you want to go, but I'm a believer that we should stay involved, not
you were just there.
Decouple. Yes, I don't believe we should decouple at all from China, but I do think we need to de-risk in the sense that we have overdependence on China in areas that are critical to our national well-being, and I think clean energy is among those. So, the subsidies, the tax subsidies in the Inflation Reduction Act, They provide huge incentives both to do things in the United States to increase our own domestic capacity. By the way, creating really some good jobs, especially for people who've been losing out in this economy, people who don't have a college education. We've seen $500 billion in manufacturing investments that have been announced because of these three pieces of legislation.
Some by people who are in this room today. So I want to open this up. I don't want to. I have a lot of questions, but I don't want to monopolize your time if other people are out there who have questions. We have one right here. Please.
Hi, Riley McCormack. How concerned are you about the return of the bond vigilantes and the market dictating your borrowing rate versus the Fed?
Well, I mean, I take it that markets determine bond rates. The bond vigilantes, I think I first came in, heard that term back in the early 1990s when inflation was high and interest rates were moving up in 94 and 95. And nominal, 10-year yields kept rising higher and higher, suggesting that the Fed's work wasn't done and they weren't doing enough. And the concern was the bond markets were driving the Fed's behavior, and that they would continue pushing the Fed to the point where the economy would fall into a recession. Now, I don't honestly think that that's the case now. I think the markets are trying to figure out what is the Fed and other central banks going to need to do to make sure that inflation stays low. I don't want to comment from my current perch on the details of monetary policy, but I think we'll see. Some people have been surprised that the U.S. economy has shown so much resilience. Consumer spending remains strong, investment spending is solid, housing is usually clobbered by tight monetary policy, and it has been, but it's stabilized and seems to be moving up. And so I think people are trying to figure out exactly what it's going to take to keep inflation moving down. And the economic resilience that they see maybe suggests higher for longer, but we'll see. And I think it's by no means a given. So,
last question, and we can do this quickly. It's a yes or no kind of question. Speaker McCarthy kept the shutdown from happening this weekend. He now stands to lose his position because of a group of renegades in his own party. Should the Democrats in the House help him keep his job?
Look, I'm not...
No, it's a yes or no.
I'm going to say neither yes nor no. It's for the Republicans and Democrats in the House to figure that out. I'm pleased that they were able to keep the government
You're glad he
up
did
and
what
running.
he did.
Yes, we have a lot more to do. We have until mid-November to pass appropriations bills or a continuing resolution. It's urgent that Congress allocate funds for Ukraine. That hasn't been done. That's really our focus. Yep. Exactly whether the speaker survives or who's speaker and how that happens, I'm going to leave.
It's not the remit of the Secretary of the Treasury.
No, it's not.
All right. Janet Yellen, thank you so much for being with us. Great to see you.
Alan.
Really a pleasure.
Good to see you too.